The scope of work as one, it is to confirm your estimate. And the second, it is to give to a contractor and make sure they're being reasonable. I mean, you want to have a very consistent approach.
Welcome to the Good Stewards Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to seasoned real estate investors who want to maximize the cash flow potential in their business. We are buy and hold investors with 1,000+ properties and markets across the U.S. who bring an insider's view into the nitty-gritty details of real estate investing. If you're looking to develop the mindset, teams, and systems that can dramatically build your real estate business and net worth, you're in the right place.
Welcome to this episode of the Good Stewards Podcast. I'm Ryan Dossie.
I'm Amanda Perkins.
I'm Bill Sirius.
And I'm Andrew Sirius. We are the Good Stewards. Please join us at thegoodstewards.com and follow us. Follow our podcast. We have pretty much everything you could want to know about buy and hold real estate or just real estate investment in general. But today we're going to be focusing on putting together a scope of work, which is something that I would say in my experience, and I think everyone here would agree with me, that the biggest area that I see new investors screw up in is the rehab. I think seasoned investors sometimes screw up as well. Yeah, seasoned investors pretty much all up and down the lot. And I don't think I've never heard an investor tell me that, I just keep overestimating my rehabs. I have
all this leftover cash. I don't
have
know what
all
to
this
do
leftover cash from my private lenders or whatever. I've never seen anything like that. It's always the other way around. Occasionally there'll be, obviously some hit their budgets, or maybe have a little bit left. But by far the most likely thing that I've seen is for them to have a bunch of extra money that they need to put into the property that they weren't expecting to. And so this podcast, we're going to focus a little bit less on the due diligence aspect, trying to figure out exactly what you need to do up front, and more about what you need to do when you're putting together a scope of work to actually have a good plan for the rehab. So real briefly in the due diligence phase, you want to look at the property, and not every property you put an offer on do you want to put together an entire detailed scope of work. It's just too much time. I mean, we were making well over 100 offers a year. At one point we were making several hundred offers a year. I know, how many offers do you think you made last year, Ryan?
Gosh, I mean, we have on average 150 to 200 sellers call us every single month requesting cash offers. So we're going through and doing kind of like quick, dirty, like roof carpet paint, not getting down to like squares or how many square footage of carpet, et cetera. So, I mean, we do a lot.
Putting together a 300 line item scope of work for each of those 150 or 200 potential sellers is probably not practical.
Not a good use of your time.
Yeah. So you want to have a very short brief. Like we have a 1-page sheet that we go down based on Jay Scott's The Book on Estimating Real Estate or Rehab Expenses. And we just we think it's going to be $2,500 in paint. We think it's going to be, $2,000 in carpet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For these, we have 26 main items. And then we add a contingency on top of that, but usually 20% for any sort of rehab expenses that just come up. Things you're not going to see everything, especially a property that needs a lot of rehab. And then also holding costs. How much is it going to cost to hold the property with whatever debt you have? Also, utilities and things like that. Once you own the property, or even preferably if you can get in and do this before you purchase the property, is putting together an entire detailed scope of work, every single line item that needs to be done. And so this goes down to, we try to be, in our opinion, the more detailed, the better, because, obviously you're not going to want to be like paint this wall and paint this wall and paint this wall and also paint that wall in this room. You can just say paint the room, but you do want to be extremely detailed, replacing doorknob, replace the doorstop, replace this light fixture instead of just fix the room. I've gotten these bids before where it's like, we're going to do X, Y, and Z in the kitchen and make it all nice. And I'm like, well, can I get a line item? Can I see exactly what you're going to do? It's like, well, I'll fix it all up. I'll make it all good. And that has never gone out well for us. My experience is pretty much entirely negative with that. I don't know. Have any of you had any experiences with the just trust me, I'll do everything that needs to be done. We'll have this
particularly if you have homeowners tracing around with you about how little it'll take to
finish up that kitchen or redo that bathroom. Everybody, homeowners and investors, even contractors, underestimate how much rehab really costs. And that's just what you can see. Then when you get into the wall, you get under the ground where the sewer is, you get on top of the roof, and there are things you do not see.
I don't know if we talked about it on the last one or not, but we had a fire at one of our properties, and a contractor came back with a $90,000 bid that was literally one line item that said repair house. And it was like, yeah, no, you're not getting this job.
So really, Andrew, you're talking about doing two scopes of work, right? You're going in and doing an initial one that you might just do as you walk through the house, maybe taking some notes, maybe not, but then going back, and if you get the house under contract or the property, the multifamily under contract, then you do you really get down to your due diligence and do a detailed scope of work.
It's like getting engaged. You don't just hop straight into the marriage.
That might be a little hyperbolic there. The first one I consider more of an estimate. I mean, it's like, I'm not saying exactly what we're going to do to the property, everything that needs to be fixed. It's just like, I think this category needs this much work. And it's just for me. I mean, I'm not, I would never accept that from a contractor. It's just, but if I'm, we were going through several hundred houses a year. I think, well, even more than that, we made offers on several hundred houses a year. Just a few years ago, we're getting back to that stage now. And it's just, you don't have enough time to do this, and it's not worth your time because you can get pretty close, and you just need to be pretty close on your estimate. The scope of work has one, it is to confirm your estimate. And the second, it is to give to a contractor and make sure they're being reasonable. I mean, a lot of times with our scopes of work, so we'll break our scopes of work down by several stages. We have the pre-construction part of it, which is the top part. We use a program called Smartsheet, which is like Excel on steroids. It just has more capabilities. Like we can attach pictures of things to the cell, and then they can just click on that and then look at a picture. So we try to take pictures of each of the things, that at least the things that matter, that might have any sort of like, what exactly were they talking about? So we take a lot of pictures and we attach them to those line items. The first stage is the pre-construction, and that's just whatever needs to be done in order for the construction to be done. So if there's no electricity in the house because all the copper wiring got ripped out, it's hard to do the rehab. So the first thing, you got to get the electrical repaired. That's in the pre-construction. You got to, if they left a dump there, there's, an enormous amount of trash that needs to be hauled off. That's pre-construction. So those sorts of things. And then we have the construction phase. And at this point, I would say to anybody, there's no perfect way to do this. Like, this works for us. I think there's some differences between the way you guys work in Oregon and the way you work in Indianapolis, Ryan. But I think you want to have a very consistent way of doing it. It can't just like, I'm going to go with my feel. I'm going to go with my gut, whatever. Like, we'll just see what happens. Like, this time I'll get a scope. This time I'll just get a lineup. This time I'll just have, just have some employees go there and just like, make it good or something. You want to have a very consistent approach. So the first part is the pre-construction. The next part is the construction. And the way we see this is just anything that can be done by our contractor, by our employees, by who's ever doing the main work. After that, and we break that down by rooms. So it's like we have the landscaping, then the exterior, then the interior, or then like the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, but second bathroom, et cetera, et cetera. After that is the vendors list. And this is just anything being done by someone outside of the main contractor. So the flooring, like the carpet and the vinyl, or the refinishing hardwoods, maybe the HVAC, just anything like that. And then after that, we have the final one is the punch out list. And this is the last bit of things that need to be done for property, usually after the property's painted. So our contractors generally go back, or sometimes we'll send a different contractor, but usually we send the same contractors. Go back and they'll do, this is like the little, like putting the door stops on, putting the door handles on, putting the blinds on, and then installing the appliances, all those little last items that need to be done. And then finally, we clean the property and list it on the market. So I think this is our orderly way of doing it. It goes from putting together a scope of work. We have a large, basically a 6-page sheet where we go through and we make notes on each item in each room. And then we transcribe that over to Smartsheet. And then we send it out for bids. And we can I mean, there are a lot of advantages to having line item bids. One is that we can just like, if we don't like a number that a contractor gives us on a particular item, we just cross it off. And so
they tend to vote with their budget. If you get a quote for something that's just insane on a particular item, that's their way of telling you they don't want to do it.
That is true. Or they don't know what they're talking about and they're just guessing. I've seen that too. But yeah, I mean, it gives you, and then, you know, you compare we've had times with where one contractor was higher than another, but that was only because they were high on a couple of items. And it's like, well, those items are sort of not really that important.
You know, I think what you guys have done too, that I've seen, and we've tried to do it as well, is you stay with the same scope of work sheet. So you are supplying your contractors with the same sheet, and they're not coming in with contractor A gives his sheet and contractor B gives her sheet and contractor C gives another one. So it's really hard to compare when they're doing it on their template. But when we're giving them our template, so we see everything consistent across the board. That is like, if you're not, folks who are listening, if you guys aren't doing that, that's the first thing to do. Get it on the same template.
Yeah, controlling the scope allows you to control the cost as well as the outcome. I know when I first started chatting with Andrew about what we were doing, that was like the biggest takeaway for us is most investors I know don't write their own scopes. They're doing what Bill mentioned. It's, hey, get me a bid, quick walkthrough. I want this done this way, this done that way. Let me know how much it costs versus here's exactly what I want done down to the line item, bid it. Makes it really easy to price shop, compare shop, but you don't run into that like, oh, that wasn't included in the scope, which I think is every investor's like favorite thing to hear from their contractor. Oh, that's a change order.
And something you almost always do here. I remember we did a rehab on it was a small apartment complex, and I think we were replacing all the window AC units, which is not an enormous expense, but it is an expense. And I sent it to him, and then he sent me back his bid on his sheet. And some of these contractor bid sheets they're as hard to read as Home Depot invoices, and it's like, they're just like, they're long, they have all these like numbers and they kind of like and they're extremely long and they're broken down and they're not really they don't seem to be broken down in a way that makes any sense. I'm sure they are for contractors somehow based on like the type of work needing to be done. But yeah, if you're comparing, one of our early mistakes was comparing, just sending out a scope, not nearly as detailed as now, but sending out a scope, and then they would send us back a bid in their own template that they had from their software or whatever. And comparing these was just an extraordinarily arduous task. You can compare the price, but sometimes they missed something or they didn't bid something. I mean, often contractors will be like, I can't do that, or I don't want to do that. I'll bid everything but that. And I've never had a contractor even give me a little bit of lip about bidding it on our sheet. And that was even including the first time we used a contractor, even back when we were relatively small. I don't think many contractors have a problem with this, but you should put the scope of work together yourself. And you should demand that they put the bid on that sheet so you can compare it. And also, especially if you haven't used someone before, you should be getting more than one bid. So, I mean, and it's much easier to compare to when you have your own sheet, especially if it's in something like Smartsheet or even Google Docs or Excel, because like we'll have like a lot of times they'll have recommendations. Like we have this a lot. Like, they'll have they'll bid everything we have, maybe except for 2 line items, and then they'll have like, well, I recommend you should do this, and here's the price for them, and then you can just line that up on the sheet when you're comparing different bids much more easily than you can if you're looking at these, one's in Excel and one's in this weird, PDF from this weird software program they bought that you've never heard of. And another one is like handwritten and illegible, but you can read the price or, on and on and on. But I think the more you can systematize it, make it straightforward, make it, put it digital. I'd say it's important for it to be digital because that way it's much more easy to compare any discrepancies. And broken, and it needs to be broken down by the line item. Those things are really critical.
I think it might be worth it to talk about the difference of having employees on staff who are doing rehab and contractors. And maybe, Amanda, you could address that a little bit because we have some of both in Oregon in particular.
That's definitely with the scope of work, that's going to be the same. But when you're managing your own crew, you're going to not be getting a bid from yourself, most likely. So there's good things and bad things with both sides. With the contractor, you're going to get that bid. It's going to be finite. That's what you're going to pay. With your in-house staff, your hope is that you get them trained up. They know, if you're managing a portfolio for rentals and rehabbing rentals, you're probably going to be making the same kinds of decisions over and over again. Like, this is kind of the product that we put out. This is the flooring we put in. These are the countertops. These are the light fixtures. These are the electrical outlets, all of that. When you have your own crew, they become familiar with all of that. And so it's less, the expectation is easier to explain because they know what our product is because they have continued to do it. What you can't control is the time, because your own staff are going to work their job. They're going to work their hours. And, you have to keep pushing them along because that time is really what can go over. Whereas a contractor, he is, pretty tied to his bid. So he is going to be trying to hit those numbers because he doesn't want to go, he wants to go less time and make a profit on it. But whereas an employee, they're going to try to do your best for you, but you also need to make sure you keep a handle on how it's going so that you don't run amok as far as the time spent into the project, because it's not necessarily the materials that are the cost. It's the labor that's the cost. And that skilled labor is not a cheap thing that you're going to be paying for. So it works both ways for us.
Having a sense of what it costs you per day is really helpful too, because that sobers you up about if it's going to take 3 more days on this project, well, that's going to cost this much more. So keeping efficiency in your staff, particularly if you have employees doing the work, is critical. But it's also true of contractors because there's holding costs that are kind of the unseen line item that is going to hurt you if they're dragging along, kind of thing, or if they have other projects that are priority over yours. We have a kind of a mix of contractors and staff that is really helpful. We actually have a few contractors that work full time for us. These guys are very skilled. We've come to trust them very, very much. They do a good job for us at a reasonable price, and they also help educate our guys on staff who are less skilled. And we've seen some of them start out barely able to swing a hammer, and now on their own with their own truck, running around, putting in doors, taking out windows, countertops on kitchens. It's kind of a thing of beauty when you see a younger person who has teachability and the gumption to hustle and get ahead to really be trained in these skills.
Andrew, as somebody who's not necessarily used a ton of scopes of work, what would you say are the major things we want to make sure they include, things that aren't necessarily necessary? What are kind of the pitfalls you see that people tend to leave out that end up coming back?
I mean, I think the biggest pitfall is just not being detailed enough. It's very tempting to just not oh, well, whatever. If you say something putty all the nail holes in the wall or whatever. I think that kind of stuff is that. It's very, very broad. It generally would work, but I'd probably even just include that for you don't want to say putty the 19 holes in the house, but you should probably put that in each room. Things if you're broad about with regard counting the number, if you have not taking pictures of things that might be difficult to sort of just convey with text. If you want them to repair 3 pieces of siding on a wall, on outside that's mostly good, and you just say the 3 pieces and that's it, it might be a little bit difficult for them. Which 3 are you talking about? Especially if there's a couple scuffs in this, that, and the other on different pieces. So I think taking pictures of that, that's why Smartsheet I think is so useful. But I think generally the biggest problem is just not kind of rushing through it, spending maybe only an hour or something like that.
Here's one thing that can really get you, and that is the sewer. we've, I think, learned to scope the sewers, which only cost a couple $100, maybe even less if you have somebody who does it regularly. I remember just recently we bought a fourplex and there was $15,000 to replace the sewer because there's some serious problems with it. At the same time, we were doing a duplex and I just flat out forgot to scope the sewer. And when it came down, the guy said, "Oh, we got a sewer problem." And I go, I was thinking of that other bill. Fortunately, it was just in a place in the yard that we dug up, and it was a repair that was under $1,000. But, kind of that stab in the heart when I thought this could be really bad. It's a great thing to know ahead of time, particularly if you're negotiating with the seller and you know that this is the case. So you certainly want to know it before rather than after.
I've actually heard sewers are a good way to retrade, get them scoped during the inspection.
You can't do it with banks. They don't care. But, well, you can do it with local banks. You can't do it with FHA or HUD or something like that. But, if you find a sewer line that's shot, that's a great way to ask for some money off. And they should pay you some, or it drops the price because, it costs money to replace sewer lines. You want to find, there's a lot of things you want to find out beforehand instead of after the fact. That's for another podcast. But I think the biggest thing we've found with bad scopes of work is just lack of detail. And I do think you can overdo it. I think you can make it so arduous to read that your eyes glaze over. You want to kind of keep each line item relatively pithy, kind of make it get to the point. You're not writing an essay. You're not writing the great American novel. You're just trying to get, but you're trying, so the details more in hitting every point and like this and then this and then this and then this, and not allowing things to get bundled together, because that will often be that when things get bundled together in one line item, like line items to do, the door and the frame and also the window and this and that, then something gets missed. That's when things get missed. And that's when one contractor bids it a certain way, or is bidding something, and another contractor is bidding something else. And that's when you start either making bad decisions with regards to which contractor you use, or you start getting properties back that are not in the condition that you expected them to be. And also when you keep having to send people out again and again and again, that delays the project, and that's just more holding costs, more opportunity costs, etc.
I think a lot of it too comes back to project management. Maybe we could talk as we end this about project management a little bit, but when you're dealing with contractors, you get 2 out of 3: speed, cost, or quality. And somewhat you got to pick 2 of the 3 that you're going to take, whichever contractor you're going with. But good project management allows you to actually raise the bar on all 3 of those: speed, price, and quality. And that's really what you want to do.
Yeah, I think writing your own scopes, the perk is, like a lot of investors, a lot of contractors don't really know their numbers. So if you've ever had a contractor, you're getting towards the end and they're out of money, and it's like, well, there's still money left in the budget. Where'd it go? Chances are they didn't bid it properly. So I find that having a detailed scope of work that you're putting them through makes them think through the actual work a little bit more, but it also makes them really understand what they budgeted for, what items, especially if you're using a GC and they're pulling in subs or something. So I think it also helps to make sure that at the end of the project, you want it to have been a good experience for you and for the contractor, ideally. And if they're constantly underbidding jobs, it's not going to go well. At the same time, if you're getting projects back that you're not happy with the quality, that doesn't go well either. So I find you kind of give them a framework to work off of, and you're going to get better results.
You'll have less conversations about, oh, why didn't do that? Because it wasn't in the scope. It wasn't in this. It helps manage your expectations so that what you get back is what you explained and conveyed that needed the work in the first place. And, again, it helps them too.
So Andrew, how would you suggest for somebody who's new, right? Like you have contacts, I have contacts, Bill has contacts. We know people in our markets that we can approach for work like this. You're brand new, you read Rich Dad Poor Dad or something, you stumbled on our podcast and you're like, hey, I want to give this a go. You find a good deal. How do you go about getting your scope of work in front of people to get bids on it? Are we trolling Home Depot parking lots at 5 a.m.? Are we pulling permits of competitors? How would you recommend somebody new goes about this instead of just throwing it on Angie's list?
I mean, I do think those are ways to do it. Well, mostly going to Home Depot and looking at which contractors there on 6 o'clock and just asking if they're looking for more work. I think the best way is referrals. I think that's generally with most things. And so now people are a little bit tighter to the chest about referring their contractors. I'll give out any bank, but I won't give out our contractors because. But that being said, that's not true of everyone, especially people who don't have a ton of projects. They do one here and then one there. So the first place I would go is to your local real estate investors association and start asking other investors there. Who do you have any contractors you'd be willing to recommend?
There might even be contractors there.
There usually are. I can't remember finding one at one of them, but yeah. We found ones we haven't used, but yeah, you can certainly you can meet contractors there. You can meet people to refer them. You can also, I don't think Craigslist or Angie's List, or especially Indeed are bad places to look. We found good contractors there. They certainly can. You got to make sure to vet them more. I mean, that's probably another topic for another podcast. But I think any investor that you already know from another way, going to like Bigger Pockets and asking in the forums, do you know any contractors you would recommend? And trolling the Home Depot parking lots and whatnot.
I think one of my favorite is driving for contractors instead of driving for dollars, right? You whip past a project and it looks like it's going well. And there's people there, hop out. Real estate's like a people business. And I think, especially now in our culture, it's so common to try to make it this like mechanical, like, oh, I hired you through an app. And some of the best guys, the skilled laborers that Bill mentioned, they don't necessarily have a website or business cards or something. They may just be working at a job site. I find most of these guys, you stop and say, hey, I'm a local investor. Is the owner on site? Good way to network. If not, hey, you looking for more work? And they're all too happy to run to their truck and pull out cards.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's one of those things I don't think you should always be kind of talking, like you don't need to be rubbing, just throwing it down throwing in people's face that you invest in real estate, but always be mentioning it. Always don't be afraid to talk about it. Have your little elevators pitch or just discuss what you're doing, post on Facebook, your last rehab or something. Like Ryan does that all the time. And, sometimes you just run across these people like, oh yeah, I do construction. Like I know this contractor or whatnot. You can find leads for just about anything in, just throughout your day and going through your normal routine, meeting the normal people you do. If you're kind of keeping it, making it very obvious what you do, don't be annoying, please. But the more you kind of let people know what you're doing, the more if they have some connection or maybe themselves have some skill that might be beneficial, you're going to learn about that. So keep it, make it very obvious what it is that you do.
I think a quick distinction I'd make, we kind of talked in the beginning about almost like the quick and dirty numbers for deciding if something's a deal or not versus the scope of work. When you're new and you're looking at deals and you have a contractor who's been kind enough to walk a property and kind of confirm your assumptions, make sure you're not asking them to do a scope when you're trying to figure out if it's a deal or not. We typically will walk through with our contractors and say, hey, give me like the quick and dirty on this, what we think this is going to cost. Here's where I'm at. Where do you think this is at? We actually don't tell them our number. We almost always end up in about the same ballpark, but then we say, okay, perfect. I think that'll work out. We do that during kind of our due diligence while we're under contract. And then we can say, perfect, get me, a full scope. So I would make sure you're not asking contractors to spend hours writing out line item bids that you have no intention of hiring because you don't think it's a deal.
No, absolutely. You don't want to waste their time. They will stop answering your phone calls. I mean, I think instead of getting like a scope, you can also ask if you're very new, you can ask a contractor to just take a look at it and give you a ballpark if you buy them lunch or something like that. Or you can do that same thing with the seasoned investors. But you don't want to ask for one scope after the next, especially like very detailed long scopes if it's not something you're planning on doing.
Real estate's a small niche, so if you get annoying, people won't forget, especially locally.
Yeah, and if you form win-win partnerships really with contractors, it might not be a formal partnership, but there becomes a point when you have somebody that's really quality that it's like I can trust this guy now. He's my painter, and I maybe I don't have to get a bid on everything. So, I mean, that can be dangerous, but there gets to be a point where some folks are like that. And it's really a point of joy when you can have that kind of a relationship.
I think the one thing I'll just kind of say in closing on this, a lot of new investors struggle with the scope of work and issuing payments. How do you pay contractors? And I think one of the most expensive lessons I learned, that hopefully I'm not the only person who's learned this, is not verifying your progress through the scope before issuing the next payment. I had a deal that I was actually in Hawaii on vacation with my wife. Got this like emotional phone call from a GC who I don't use anymore. And it was like, man, I got to pay the guys. They've got, kids to feed, et cetera. And, man, we need that final draw. It's almost done. We're in punch out. And, so, from my phone, I wired the guy the final like $8,000. I think I held back $1,000, got there and he was maybe halfway done. And it's a lot easier to get them to do work when you still have the money they want versus they're like, there's a whole bunch of work I have been paid for that I didn't have to do. So I would recommend, as you have a scope, as you've outlined kind of their payment structure through it, make sure that you're verifying the scope and their progress before issuing payments. It's really, really easy to get in trouble if you don't do that.
Absolutely. I think we'll go through the final takeaways here. My final takeaway is the biggest thing is the mistakes are almost always in one direction. It's almost always, you almost always budget too little money for a project. You almost always don't have enough detail, enough line items. So the mistakes are generally, it's not one of those like it is find the Goldilocks zone, right? Not too much, not too little, but it's almost every time the mistakes are made with not enough detail and not enough money budgeted. So those are the way to think about when you're trying to make sure that you don't, when you're not trying to make a mistake, know where most of the mistakes are made, and you'll usually be able to avoid them.
I don't think I've ever got to the end of a deal that I made a mistake on and been like, wow, that was not preventable.
Absolutely.
I'd say one thing I would recommend when you're walking through and you're saying things like, well, I think we could probably live with those kitchen cabinets. I think we could probably live with that vanity. I think we could probably live with that carpet. You might be fooling yourself. And when you get back in, those might actually be real costs that you have to incur. So be careful not to be naive about what needs to be changed. And
if you're making a lot of I could live with that, chances are you didn't get a good enough deal. So you don't have enough budget to really rehab it. You're basically lipsticking a pig or slumlording it at that point.
Which just means down the road, you're going to be putting more money into it. So,
all right. Well, before this goes completely awry, thank you for tuning in this episode. If you like what you heard, remember to like and subscribe to the podcast and get your free copy of our ebook. Visit www.thegoodstewards.com for more info. Connect with us and submit any questions or topics you'd like us to talk about. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time.